The 1964 Socorro, New Mexico UFO case is among the most credible of all close encounters, listed by the United States Air Force's Project Blue Book as unknown, despite their well-documented efforts to debunk and dismiss the UFO phenomenon. At the time, the head of Project Blue Book cited it as the best documented case on record. This case involved a craft reminiscent of the one encountered and filmed during the Tic Tac encounters in 2004. This case demonstrates a cover-up perpetrated by the United States Air Force and the FBI of the landing of a UFO, the sighting of possible non-human beings, as well as what may have been an alien symbol. We have over a dozen witnesses and a virtually unimpeachable primary eyewitness, Officer Lonnie Zamora, who was haunted by his encounter for the rest of his life. Socorro, New Mexico is a small town northeast of the White Sands Missile Range and the Trinity site, where the first atomic bomb was tested in 1945. On April 24, 1964, around 5:25, an Albuquerque TV station received a call from a frightened and concerned citizen who just bore witness to an anomaly in the sky. He described seeing a white, oval, or egg-shaped metallic object gliding across the sky heading south. What disturbed the man was that the object had practically no resemblance to any type of known aircraft. Roughly 20 minutes later, around 5:40, two young men, Paul Keyes and Larry Kratzer, were driving north towards Socorro, New Mexico, along US Highway 60, when they too witnessed the strange egg traversing the sky. Days later, on April 29th, their account would be published in the Dubuque, Iowa-based newspaper, the Telegraph Herald. Quote, "Dubuque men spotted a flying saucer, or a secret military craft, or maybe an alien spaceship near Socorro, New Mexico." The two men were later interviewed by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, as well as Iowa-based UFO investigator Ralph C. DeGraw. They were driving just southwest of Socorro at about 6 p.m. that day when they noticed something shiny and a cloud of smoke near the ground in the vicinity of the town. Kratzer stated he watched as, quote, "a round saucer or egg-shaped object ascended vertically from the black smoke. After climbing vertically out of the smoke, the object leveled off and moved in a southwest direction." Later, the two witnesses heard a newscast about Zamora's sighting, and the significance of what they had seen became apparent. These two witnesses eventually stopped corresponding with UFO researchers, seeking no publicity nor to be associated with flying saucers. At 5:45, a family from Colorado was driving through New Mexico on US Highway 85, approaching Socorro. All 5 members of the Colorado family became witnesses to something strange in the sky as they neared Socorro. The wife was the first to spot the object in the sky. Her husband recognized the fear in her voice. She pointed to an object in the sky to the right of the car's windshield. The couple's children, 3 young boys sitting in the back seat, quickly began watching the bizarre egg-shaped object through the window. The egg was white and metallic, resembling aluminum, and it appeared to be longer than their car, a 1955 Cadillac. The egg seemed to float across the sky only a few hundred feet northeast of the family's car. The entire family was perplexed by the object. They stared at it and failed to identify what they were seeing. As they continued watching the object, it soon dropped abruptly, now silently hovering merely 10 feet over the ground, and to their horror began heading directly for the family's car. It passed barely 3 feet over their car, briefly eclipsing the desert sun and casting a dark shadow over the car. The object then silently zipped southwest before stopping abruptly. It was silhouetted by the sun as it began to go into a controlled descent, disappearing behind a small hill. The driver was voicing his anger at the apparent carelessness of whoever was piloting the bizarre aircraft for causing a near miss with his car when the family witnessed a police cruiser pursuing the object. After arriving in town, the family stopped at a small gas station managed by a man named Opal Grinder. Zamora's close encounter was not known to the public until the following day, which was when Opal began to put the pieces together, realizing that the tourists who stopped in his gas station must have witnessed the very same UFO which Officer Zamora saw. Opal later attested to all of this in a sworn affidavit. Quote, "That is why I reported the incident with the tourists. I wanted people to know that other persons saw the same object Lonnie Zamora saw. Lonnie wasn't just seeing things."
Well, that tourist came up here and wanted gasoline. He come from the south, and he said, "Your aircraft around here flies awfully low." I said, "Well, how was that, sir?" He said, "Well, it like knocked me off the road out there." He said, "It must have been in trouble." So the policeman was going to it. So I asked him, "Was it the helicopter?" He said, "No." He said, "If it was, it's a funny looking one." So he went on about his affairs, and I was making up the bank deposits for the bank at 15 to 6, and that was the same time he was here. And the next morning, well, it dawned on me that the time element was the same time that the tourist was in here, that Zamora went to that object that was on the ground there. And I called the radio station, told him Zamora was not telling a lie, because the tourist seen something and didn't think much of it. And he saw the policeman also going to the object that was on the ground, which was a UFO.
This incident is usually referred to as the Lonnie Zamora case, which is understandable given that he is the primary witness. But I feel that it misrepresents the case as a single witness event, which is not true. Lonnie Zamora was born in Magdalena, New Mexico on September 7, 1933. Before beginning his career in law enforcement, Lonnie worked in the machine shop at New Mexico Tech. He had also served in the Army. At the time of the encounter, he had been serving as a police officer with the Socorro Police Department for 5 years. At almost exactly the same time as the Colorado family witnessed the UFO from their car, Officer Zamora was on a typical patrol. He was sitting in his cruiser called Socorro 2 when he was passed by a speeding vehicle. Zamora thought the driver appeared to be a teenage boy around 17 years old. In fact, Zamora was confident he recognized the driver. Officer Zamora began pursuing the speeding vehicle, allowing the speeder to remain roughly 3 blocks ahead of him to avoid detection until he could get an accurate measure of its speed. At 5:45, roughly 50 seconds after he began chasing the speeding vehicle, Officer Zamora heard a powerful roar and saw a bluish-orange flame in the sky. The flame was smokeless, funnel-shaped, and unlike anything Zamora had seen before. In his later testimony, Zamora said that the sun was to his west and impeded his vision. His initially poor visibility of the object was compounded by the fact that he was wearing prescription glasses with green-tinted sunglasses over them. He was nearly opposite from the Colorado family, who saw the object silhouetted against the sky and the light of the sun. Naturally, Zamora decided to disengage his chase to investigate the unidentified object. The object was low and heading in the general direction of a dynamite shack owned by the mayor. Worried that people could be in danger, Zamora turned his cruiser to the right, coming off the paved road and onto a rough dirt road, passing a small church. On his way, he radioed in to dispatch to tell them of what he was up to. As Zamora struggled to traverse the rough, bumpy terrain, he could hear a continuous roar coming from the flame. Zamora later stated, "The flame was bluish, very brilliant, a little orange around the edges, more so near the bottom. It was sort of motionless, but appeared to descend slowly. Still driving the car, I couldn't pay too much attention to the flame. It was a narrow type, like a stream down, cone-shaped, narrower at the top than at the bottom." I couldn't see the bottom of the flame. It was behind a hill from my view. Didn't notice any smoke, but some dust seemed to be moving over the land in that general direction. The sky was mostly clear, just a few clouds scattered around. Wind was blowing against me from about the south, southeast, or maybe the southwest. I could tell by the way dust flew off when I was trying to put the car up that first hill to where I had a view of the ravine and the object down in it. As Socorro 2 struggled to climb the steep, rough terrain, Zamora could still hear the roar of the object. The flame was eclipsed by a rough gravel hill, which Zamora also struggled to climb, but succeeded after 3 attempts. As he was finally getting traction and crossing over the hill, the roar lowered in frequency until it went silent. On the hilltop, Zamora looked out the window of his car and spotted a strange, quote, egg-shaped object, the size of a car, resting in the ravine to the southwest. It was white and metallic against the mossy background. Zamora tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Quote, at about 15 yards or so to the southwest, I saw the object. It was down there in the ravine off the road. At first glance, I stopped. At first, I wanted to think it looked like a white car turned over, maybe on its side, with the far end somehow higher than the nearer one. But that didn't seem right, the way it looked. Still, I was inclined to think that it was so for just a few moments, thinking maybe some kids might have accidentally turned over a car. Zamora realized he had never seen anything like the object. It was oval-shaped and resting on 4 extended legs, like landing gear. He could see no doors or windows on the craft's body, nor any seams or ridges at all. Zamora noticed 2, quote, children wearing white uniforms standing next to the craft. He described the 2 as small adults or large children. One of the figures seemed startled by the sight of Zamora's car coming towards them. It seemed to jump as if frightened. In his own words, when it turned, it looked him square in the face. Quote, then I saw 2 small figures in what resembled white coveralls pretty close to the object on its northwest side, as if inspecting it. They were standing between it and a good-sized greasewood bush. One of the figures, the one in front nearest me, seemed to turn as if it heard or saw my car coming. It must have seen me, because when it turned and looked straight at my car, it seemed startled, almost seemed to jump somewhat. He only saw the figures for about 2 seconds. He later indicated in an interview with Dr. Hynek and Ray Stanford that they were roughly 4 feet tall based on the bushes they were standing next to. He also stated that they wore no helmets or headgear of any kind. Zamora then lost sight of the object and the figures as he crossed the uneven terrain and hills. At this point, Zamora radioed the sheriff's office to let them know he was investigating a possible accident in the desert. As he struggled again with the rough terrain, trying to get closer to the object, he was trying desperately to comprehend what he just witnessed, having no framework to understand the bizarre sight. As Ray Stanford wrote, a real battle of acceptance of what he had seen was going on inside the policeman's mind. Although he had radioed the initial idea that a car was in the ravine, he was beginning to feel certain that what he had just been looking at was not a car in any ordinary sense of the word. He had seen extensions sticking downward from either side of the object as it rested in the ravine southwest of him, with its long axis pointing in his direction and downward. The presence of the legs, the white clothing of the 2 small figures beside the craft, and its general appearance from about 450 feet all contributed to Zamora's growing suspicion that he was encountering something in which he had never believed, never wanted to believe, or else might be a force-landed experimental vehicle from White Sands Proving Grounds, something that maybe he should not be seeing. Zamora radioed back to the sheriff's office and requested that New Mexico State Police Sergeant Samuel Chavez come to the scene alone. Zamora's mind was racing with possibilities. He trusted Chavez and needed a reliable witness to come and see the object as well, so he would not be accused of hallucinating the encounter. Zamora also felt that if the object was indeed an experimental craft from White Sands Proving Grounds, Chavez could be trusted to keep the secret and notify the proper authorities. As Zamora came around a bend and scaled another hill, he was able to see the object again, where it rested in the bottom of a ravine, but this time he was much closer, a mere 50 feet away. It was now 5:47 when Zamora stopped his car at a vantage point to view the object, but he would have to get out to see it. He was still talking into his radio when he started to get out of the car and his microphone fell. After hanging his microphone up, he began to get out of the car and heard, quote, "a heavy slam, metal-like, heavier than a tank hatch. I'm familiar with tanks from the army. A slam came from the object. Then another slam, real loud, like the first one, occurred a second or so later. I got out of the car quickly and turned around toward the object in the arroyo. From my new position, viewing from northwest, I was able to see mainly what might have been the side of the object, not the end as first noticed from over the first mesa to the northeast. It was oval shape. Could see a lot more from that second position. It was smooth, saw no windows or doors. I had hardly hung the mic up and heard that slamming when I turned around and headed for the object, stepping pretty fast. Had gone maybe 3 paces toward the object when I heard a sudden, very loud, ear-splitting roar. Zamora feared that the object was going to explode, so he turned back and dived into the dirt in the prone position, with his face away from the object as it rose with blue flame and heat. Quote, I immediately noted what resembled bright blue flame under the object, same time as the roar started. I immediately thought the thing might be exploding, so I had been trained to be prepared for explosions in the army. I hit the dirt in a prone position, there on the slope for a moment, until I heard the roar continue and knew there was no explosion. Had felt some heat against my body from the flame, I guess, when I was nearer it, there in the prone position on the slope. Wasn't strong heat, though. Zamora would later describe something which he found particularly strange to Ray Stanford. Quote, that roaring flame, it looked like it should have bounced, deflected, off the ground, but it didn't. Though Zamora no longer thought the object was going to explode, he still wanted to get his car between himself and the object. Looking over his shoulder and keeping the object in sight, he ran behind his car, bumped his leg on the rear fender, dropped his sunglasses, and continued running away from the object, which was still hovering near the ground. In the moment, Zamora was too frightened to retrieve his sunglasses. Amidst the takeoff of the unusual craft, Officer Zamora noticed something on the side of the object, a red insignia. Quote, just before roar started, I had noted a red insignia, or shape, on the side of the object. Then the noise and flame came on, and I couldn't take time to notice much else before I hit the dirt, then got up, ran into my car, and lost my glasses. Unquote. We will come back to this point. The insignia is a key element of this encounter. Zamora's testimony continues, quote, when I started running again, after falling that is, guess I looked back maybe 2 times or so at first, and noted the object had risen, maybe to level with the car. Could have been 20 feet above the bottom of the arroyo. I'd say it took about 6 seconds for it to get that high above where it had been sitting. I kept on running, maybe another 25 feet, and jumped just over the north edge of the hill. That's when I turned around toward the object and shielded my eyes with my arm in case it still might explode. That's when the roar stopped. That surprised me, I think. Guess I expected it to continue on roaring like that. I'd thought about running on down the slope, but that roar was what was scaring me. So it stopped. Then I stopped and turned around. Immediately, I heard a sharp tone, a whining sound. Sound went from high tone to low tone in, say, maybe a second, then stopped. After that, there was no sound. You could have heard a pin drop. Notice that at this time, the object was no longer rising. It just started moving away from me to the west-southwest, staying about the same distance above the ground, moving away fast. I never heard another sound from it. Ray Stanford would later note that Zamora seemed very relieved when he reached this part of his account. He seemed to be very troubled by the incident, even as he recounted it days later. Lonnie watched the object fly away at a high rate of speed. It made no noise, nor did it leave any smoke or vapor trails as it flew off toward a distant mountain. It flew against the wind, yet seemed to accelerate like nothing he had ever seen before. Now convinced that he needed additional witnesses to the craft, he ran back to his car and radioed the Socorro sheriff dispatcher, Ned Lopez, again. Lopez said that when he picked up the call, Zamora sounded out of breath. He told Lopez to hurry and look out the window for a flying object. Though in the excitement and confusion, Zamora neglected to tell Lopez which window to look through, and so Lopez went to the wrong window and saw nothing. Zamora could still see the object as he spoke to Lopez. He would later state, "I couldn't tell what might have kept the thing up or going. It was now completely silent. It kept about that same height above the ground, 10 to 15 feet, and never did get much higher until it got over near the perlite mill on the west side of US 60, maybe a mile away. Then it angled up at a steep climb and got small in the distance, over the canyon or mountain that way, very fast." While interviewing Zamora, Stanford was told that the object's flight puzzled him. Quote, "When there was the flame and roar, the object rose slowly, like it was heavy. Seemed like an effort getting up that 20 feet or so, I'd say. But when there was silence and no roar or flame or nothing, everything looked easy. Looked like no effort to take off across toward the perlite mill and to climb up at least at a 45-degree angle, real fast after that." Meanwhile, Sergeant Chavez had missed his turn and had to turn around. Because of this, he pulled up to a distant hill northeast of Zamora just as the craft was about to disappear. The object looked like a bright white oval and got smaller and smaller as it sped away before disappearing. It is estimated that the craft disappeared from sight at 5:47, roughly 1 minute and 50 seconds after Zamora first noticed the craft. While Chavez's car was finally in view, Zamora took out his notepad and drew the symbol that he saw on the craft so he would not forget it. This symbol was soon kept secret by the authorities and was actually altered in the public reports in an effort to rule out hoaxes. Zamora then walked down into the ravine where the craft had landed for a mere 30 to 50 seconds. He was surprised to find burning grass and smoldering bushes. Zamora was overwhelmed to find the first piece of physical evidence of the surreal object. He was deeply shaken by the encounter. He walked back up to his cruiser to meet with Sergeant Chavez. Zamora was noticeably pale and sweating profusely. Chavez later said that he was, quote, as white as a sheet. Chavez said, quote, "Lonnie, what's been going on? You look like you've seen the devil." "Maybe I have," Zamora said. He then led Chavez down into the ravine and showed him the burning vegetation. The two inspected the landing site when Chavez noticed tracks in the dirt. 4 imprints fairly deep into the soil formed a quadrangle, evidently left by the legs of the craft. The imprints appeared to be wedge-shaped and created with a great amount of force pressing into the tightly packed soil of the ravine. The imprints were 4 to 6 inches deep. It was later written in the local newspaper that the imprints did not appear to have been made by an object striking the earth with great force, but by an object of considerable weight settling to earth at slow speed and not moving after touching the ground. It has been suggested, judging by the distance between the landing tracks as well as the depth of the indentations, that the marks were created by an equal distribution of weight. Senior Patrolman Ted Jordan and Undersheriff James Lucky overheard Zamora's radio comms and arrived only a few minutes after Chavez. They were joined by a cattle inspector who happened to be in the area and heard Zamora's transmissions on his two-way radio. Zamora was quoted saying that one of the bushes was burned bare by exhaust heat and that it was still smoking several minutes after the craft's departure. Chavez was also quoted as saying that the grass and greasewood bushes were still smoldering during the initial investigation. Jordan later filled out a sworn statement saying, quote, "When I arrived, greasewood branches were still smoking." Lucky and Chavez were later quoted in the Socorro newspaper saying that the burned vegetation was still hot when they arrived only moments later to investigate. For the following hour, Zamora was bombarded with questions by his fellow officers as they investigated the landing site. They all noted that there was no odor which would have been caused by combustion of conventional fuel, despite the fact that some bushes were still burning even when the other two policemen arrived. Samples of the burned bush were tested, and no conventional types of fuel or any other chemicals were detected. Ted Jordan told Stanford that what impressed him most at the landing site was that it appeared as if the flame had sliced a greasewood bush near the middle of the quadrangle without any sign of turbulence or conventional propulsion. Quote, "They'll never explain that thing Lonnie saw as any pogo, helicopter, or anything I know about. The flame from that damn thing just sliced that greasewood bush in half. Just burned it off clean like a blade of fire had cut right through it." Ted Jordan would explain to Stanford in a later interview, quote, "I always figure that in police work, one photograph can be worth 1,000 words. So I was glad to have the camera along when I heard Lonnie that afternoon, calling out on the radio about what he was seeing. Just wish I could have been there with Lonnie. My Argus C3 would have gotten a pretty good shot of that thing he saw." Jordan got his camera out of his patrol car and headed down into the ravine. He took careful measurements with his light meter before taking each picture. Jordan photographed the 4 imprints, the burned vegetation, and the rest of the scene within 10 minutes of the craft's departure. Unfortunately, Jordan's film was later confiscated by the United States Air Force, who promised to return his film. Despite later assurances that he would receive his film or he would be paid for them, Jordan received neither. His film was never returned by the Air Force. These pictures would later play a key role in the cover-up of this incident, as well as the possible exotic energy utilized by the UFO. By 6 o'clock, an FBI agent had been dispatched to the UFO landing site. J. Arthur Burns was from Albuquerque, but happened to be in the state police office in Socorro on business when he heard Lopez tell Chavez that Zamora wanted him to come to the ravine because, in the words of the FBI report, an unknown object landed there. He would also give the suggestion to preserve the landing site by placing rocks around the landing gear imprints. The FBI report also noted that every investigator on the scene noted the 4 irregularly shaped, smoldering areas. Just before 7, Chavez and Zamora left the landing site after discussing the incident for over an hour. Despite Zamora's description of the small humanoids, Chavez became concerned that the craft was some sort of experimental craft from White Sands. Chavez then went to the state police office and contacted the U.S. Army in case the craft was indeed from White Sands. The FBI agent, J. Arthur Burns, contacted Captain Richard T. Holder, the uprange commander at White Sands Missile Range, to report that a UFO allegedly landed in the Socorro area. At 7:10, Captain Holder received Agent Burns' message and tried to return his call, but the line was busy. Holder knew that he would have to get to the state police office to get the facts of the case and began getting dressed. Burns called back 3 minutes later and began explaining the incident to Holder. Holder took the matter seriously and told Burns he would arrive at the state police office in 5 minutes. Captain Holder and Agent Burns met and checked one another's credentials before discussing the UFO case and interrogating Zamora in a closed-door session. It's important to note that Captain Holder would later refer to Zamora in an official document to his superiors as the only witness initially, meaning the authorities soon gathered that others also witnessed the UFO, a fact which was largely ignored. Historically, the FBI has had an involvement in UFO investigations. In 1947, the FBI investigated the original, real X-Files during the infamous wave of UFO activity that year. The FBI sent agents across the Pacific Northwest to investigate sightings primarily of disc and sphere-type UAPs. They investigated now famous cases such as the Kenneth Arnold sighting, which made the term flying saucer known to the world. They also investigated the mysterious Maury Island case, which ultimately led to the strange deaths of 2 Air Force investigators. To this day, the FBI maintains an interest in the UFO phenomenon, as members of the FBI met with Congress to discuss UAP, and they were reportedly far more transparent than the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, which is supposed to be solely concerned with UAP. However, during the Zamora case, the agency sought to conceal their involvement. In Captain Holder's report, he included a footnote which stated, "By request of Agent J. Arthur Burns, Jr., please do not refer to the Federal Bureau of Investigation as participating in any fashion." The FBI's report, dated May 8, 1964, notes that Zamora was personally known by Burns for about 5 years and is, quote, well regarded as a sober, industrious, and conscientious officer and not given to fantasy. As Holder and Burns questioned Zamora about every last detail of his encounter, they made 2 important requests to Zamora. Agent Burns said to Zamora, "It will be better if you don't publicly mention seeing the 2 small figures in white. No one will believe you anyhow." At the time, Zamora did not wish to question the FBI's wishes and decided to comply and self-censor himself on the humanoid aspect of his sighting. Ray Stanford wrote, "It took some convincing to get Lonnie to tell me what individual in authority had made the 'don't talk about the little men' recommendation. He finally told me that this was why he had been publicly hesitant when asked about the 2 humanoids he initially had reported. In fact, he had tried so hard to conceal the humanoid part of his experience after Burns' recommendation that some researchers took it as a denial that any humanoids had been seen. For months after the incident, Zamora continued to speak in highly veiled terminology of the 2 humanoids he had seen, except in official closed-door interviews, including one with Dr. J. Allen Hynek and me." The other recommendation came from Captain Holder, who told Zamora, "If I were you, I wouldn't describe the symbol you saw on the side of the vehicle to anyone except official investigators." Holder reasoned that if the symbol was kept from public knowledge, and then reports of the same symbol were made, the investigators would know the reports were authentic. His explanation also implies that Holder believed Zamora's report was authentic. This would then imply that the object was not a secret experimental craft, because Holder was the uprange commander at White Sands Missile Range. The intelligence agents would certainly not need to rely on a description of an insignia to determine witness authenticity. Thus, we can assume that the statement Holder made to the public the following day is likely accurate. Quote, "I was contacted on the evening of April 24th by local authorities to determine whether White Sands Missile Range or Holloman Air Force Base had anything that might produce the conditions described. Neither White Sands Missile Range nor Holloman had an object that would compare to the object described, and there was no known firing mission in progress at the time of the occurrence that would produce the conditions reported." Holder also said that the following morning he received a phone call from a colonel who was calling from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who ordered Holder to read aloud the report on the Zamora case. This caused Holder to ask himself why the Pentagon had such an interest in Zamora's sighting. We have to wonder why elements of the military and the intelligence community influenced Zamora to censor key details of his close encounter. Why was the FBI concerned with censoring information about humanoids? Zamora was questioned by Burns and Holder for roughly half an hour before being released. Afterwards, everyone involved went to the landing site, joined by a few other authorities. As they investigated the landing site, 2 additional groups of imprints or tracks were found in the soil. There was a group of 4 shallow, circular indentations in the soil. Ray Stanford wrote, "The relative positions of the indentations suggests that some type of ladder may have been extended down from some door or hatch on the western side of the southwest half of the craft, as positioned when landed." According to the hypothesis, the presence of the 4 generally small, similar indentations at that location might be explained by the 2-legged ladder having been repositioned after having been first touched down to the ground beneath the supposed hatch or opening on the craft, through which it has been suggested the 2 humanoids may have exited and subsequently entered again. Since one pair of the imprints was somewhat deeper than the other set, one might assume that the deeper set of indentations represent the position in which the ladder was actually used by the occupants, while the less distinct set might be interpreted to have been, perhaps, a trial positioning of the ladder. We shall never know the truth of the matter, but the other evidence and observations seem to at least tentatively reinforce this explanation of the group of 4 imprints found within the quadrangle. The other set of prints are much more interesting, as they were believed to be the footprints of the occupants. Located 5 feet south of the center of the northwest landing gear pad, precisely where Zamora saw the humanoid standing. There appeared to be footprints left by a person or persons with relatively small feet wearing shoes. State Police Senior Patrolman Ted Jordan specifically described one of the clearer prints as looking, quote, like a heel print with the instep over a small clump of grass, unquote. All of the policemen who Stanford interviewed that would dare to speculate thought that perhaps these were tracks left by the 2 small humanoids Zamora saw outside of the craft. During the investigation of the landing site, extensive measurements were made, but ultimately, the authorities were not properly equipped to investigate such an incident. One of the greatest failures that day was that no radiation detection equipment was used at the landing site. Only 2 days later did authorities check the site for radiation, but that left too much time for any possible radiation present to dissipate. Stanford wrote, "While we are still discussing the evidence found at the landing site, it is interesting to note that, from what we know about the timing on Zamora's experience, the very maximum time which the 2 humanoids Zamora observed could possibly have been outside the craft is 50 seconds. This assumes that the very instant the roaring exhaust was heard to cease when the craft landed, the 2 beings climbed out. It also assumes that they did not get back inside until the very moment Zamora heard the 2 successive slamming sounds. Actually, in all likelihood, some seconds were required for a hatch to open, for the supposed ladder, if there was one, to be put in place, etc. Thus, we might realistically figure the 2 beings could have been outside the craft for from 20 to 40 seconds. This would have given them precious little time in which to do any repairs to the craft. As some persons have suggested, the craft had landed in that ravine for repair. Since the vehicle departed, at least by our present technological standards, with admirable facility, there is reason to question the idea that the purpose of its landing was of very much an emergency nature. In the short time involved, the humanoids could not have walked very far outside the craft, especially since we can be relatively sure that they soon headed back inside after seeing the police car approach. This would leave a mere 20 seconds maximum in which they were not aggravated by the problem of escaping before Zamora got there. It boils down to the fact that they must have come out of the craft, gone to the place where Lonnie saw them, and upon seeing the police car, headed right back aboard. Does the evidence at the site appear to confirm such a short period of extravehicular activity? Indeed it does. We have the seeming ladder marks and the grouping of apparent tracks precisely where Zamora saw the two humanoids standing. The grouping of shoe prints was centered at 5 to 7 feet from where the humanoids, hypothetically, would have gotten off the ladder. No shoe prints were seen immediately around the base of the ladder, but most of the soil between the ladder and the shoe prints was covered with vegetation." Unquote. Eventually, FBI agent Burns, Captain Holder, and Officer Zamora left the landing site and returned to Chavez's office. They were then notified that 3 reports were received from independent witnesses describing anomalous lights in the sky around the landing area shortly after Zamora's initial report. Quote, "Upon arrival at the office location in the Socorro County building, we were informed by Nep Lopez, Sheriff's Office radio operator, that approximately 3 reports had been called in by telephone of a blue flame of light in the area. The dispatcher indicated that the times were roughly similar." Unquote. Given the urgency of the mystery surrounding Zamora's encounter, Holder reportedly stayed up until 1 in the morning to finish writing his report. Zamora reportedly went straight to his church and spent a long time discussing the incident with his priest. He wondered if he had seen something, quote, "unnatural." Lonnie's wife, Mary, stated in a later interview, quote, "It was the middle of the night by the time Lonnie came home. He was real pale, and I thought he was sick. I said, 'Are you sick or something?' He said, 'No, I was just working.' Like he was angry. What I knew about it was when I started reading the papers. It started coming out and everything. I said, 'Well, what's this that you saw?' 'I don't know,' he said. 'It's just a headache. Everybody's after me, and some believe me and some don't.'" Unquote. The incident continued to bother Zamora. That night, he couldn't sleep, and soon after, he changed his work hours to night shift because, quote, "At night, I couldn't sleep. I would come home from work and sit up for hours thinking about it. It was more frightening than anything that can happen. You can get into a gun battle and you're scared, but once it's over, it's over. But this you can't forget." Zamora later said, "I'd still say it was something not from here. If I could find out what it actually was, okay, I'm satisfied. I just didn't want to go through it again. If they believe me, it's alright. If they don't want to believe me, that's alright too." In an interview with the Albuquerque Journal of the August 2nd, 1983 issue, Zamora was quoted as saying, "If I can just forget about it, maybe it will go away." According to his family and close friends, this encounter changed his life forever, and he was much more quiet afterwards. Friends knew never to mention the subject, and would only talk about it if Lonnie brought it up first. In Stanford's book, he wrote that a, quote, "bubbly rock, as well as vitrified sand, was discovered at the landing site by authorities in the hours after the encounter." Quote, "I first heard about the rock through 3 law enforcement officers from Socorro, and Lonnie Zamora verified their accounts, even though official recommendations were given to them to the effect that it will not be publicly discussed. My initial information on the vitrified sand came from Richard Hall in 1975. He sent me a copy of a letter written to him by the late Dr. James McDonald, senior atmospheric physicist at the University of Arizona. McDonald told Hall that he had information from, quote, a woman who is now a radiological chemist with the Public Health Service in Las Vegas, who was involved in some special analysis of the materials collected at the Socorro site, and when she was there the morning after, she claims that there was a patch of melted and resolidified, vitrified sand right under the landing area. I have talked to her both by telephone and in person shortly after she finished the work on the Socorro specimens. Air Force personnel came and took all her notes and materials and told her she wasn't to talk about it anymore." Nuclear physicist and UFO researcher Stanton Friedman also spoke to the radiological chemist who analyzed the Socorro material. One of the Socorro police officers described the scene of the discovery of some physical evidence, perhaps the altered rock, the vitrified sand, or both. Quote, "An Air Force officer was standing near the center of the landing quadrangle. He looked down at a large rock which had a bubbly-looking surface. Then he bent down for a closer look. A puzzled expression came over his face. Without saying a word, he began to walk around the area, looking at other rocks to see if any of them looked the same on the surface. They did not. His face betraying an increasing sense of interest, the officer returned to the rock and called Zamora to his side. He wanted Zamora's own opinion as to which areas of the landing site had been exposed severely to the flame-like, brilliant blue exhaust of the craft. Lonnie did not hesitate a second. "Where we're standing, sir," Zamora replied. "That's where things seem to have been burned most." Portions of the rock revealed a strange texture, glassy or bubbly. Yet small areas even seemed to have been turned into a powder. Whether or not the vitrified sand or the glassy, melted rock ever existed, neither have ever been acknowledged by the authorities. Major Hector Quintanilla Jr. was the head of Project Blue Book, the United States Air Force's public-facing UFO investigation effort. Described his recollection of that day as follows. "All hell broke loose on April 24th, 1964, and I started smoking again." The morning after the encounter, the news was released to media outlets and generated massive interest. United Press International broke the story, and soon after, many would come looking for the landing site. Investigators, both civilian and military, would be eager to reach Socorro. Major Quintanilla wrote, "During the course of the investigation, and immediately thereafter, everything that was possible to verify was checked. The communications media must have been waiting for a case like this, because immediately after Zamora reported his sighting, all hell broke loose. The telephone at my house was ringing off the hook. I went to my office so that I could direct the investigation from there, and at the same time contact Kirtland, Holloman, and White Sands via our telephone communications system. As I walked into our building and turned into the hallway towards my office, I could hear the telephone ringing. The operator informed me that I had 10 or 12 calls waiting for me. I decided not to accept the calls until after I had talked with my UFO investigating officer at Kirtland. Major Connor was my primary investigator at Kirtland, but he was inexperienced. Fortunately, my chief analyst, Sergeant David Moody, was on temporary duty at Kirtland. I asked Major Connor to get in touch with him and for Moody to get in touch with me, regardless of the hour. It was hours before the investigation could be organized and on its way. A Geiger counter had to be found and the base photographer had to be called. The staff car, which had been provided for the investigation, had a flat tire midway between Albuquerque and Socorro. The Stallion Range officer had already conducted a preliminary investigation and had also interviewed Zamora. This information was turned over to the Air Force investigators as soon as they began their interview with Zamora. Connor and Moody kept in touch with me and provided me with good information, but there was nothing from which we could draw a definite conclusion or a decent evaluation. The news media was on SAFOI's back, and SAFOI was on my back. I didn't have any idea as to what Zamora saw and reported, but by God, I was going to find it. That day, Lonnie was interviewed by reporter Walter Schroed of KSRC Radio.
This is Walter Schroed, your roving reporter at KSRC Radio in Socorro, New Mexico. We have with us this afternoon Mr. Lonnie Zamora, the Socorro patrolman that while chasing a car, found himself in an area about 2 miles west of Socorro and 1 mile east of KSRC radio station, at which time he reports he came upon an unidentified object resting on 4 legs. That as he drew closer, the object took off with a loud roar spouting blue, red flame and disappeared in the sky. A great number of cars and Socorro people have gathered here in front of the studios of KSRC to catch a glimpse of Mr. Zamora as he arrived and welcome him with their car horns. Mr. Zamora, after coming upon this object, just what did happen?
I went up that little road for about half a mile, I guess. Came up to this little barking deal there on the side of the road, and I sort of glanced out of the window, looked to my left, and seen this white object on the ground. So I thought it might be a car that had turned over. So I was the real big hurry going out there to investigate. Thought maybe somebody would be hurt. That time I saw this white egg-shaped looking object.
It looked something like an egg, you mean?
Yeah, from the distance I was, it looked like an egg to me.
About the size of a car, I think someone said.
Yes, sir, it looked like the car had turned over. That's why I say it's the size of a car.
And did it have any kind of markings on it of any kind that you noticed?
Yes, it did. Not from that far, I didn't see the markings. When I went up closer to it, I did see the markings.
And someone said that the markings that you saw it was an upside-down V with 3 lines running through it.
No, sir, I couldn't tell you that because they still don't want me to say nothing about the markings.
They don't want you to say anything about the markings. All right, we won't question you on that. And if we run into an area that they don't want you to talk about, well, you just say so. And this happened about 5:30 Friday afternoon.
It happened about 5:50, about 10 minutes to 6.
About 10 minutes to 6. And you did place a call in to Sergeant Tavis of the state police to come on out and help you with the investigation.
As soon as I saw this object, I didn't know what it was. I placed a call to Sergeant Tavis of the state police. Told him if he would come out there and help me on this. He said, yes, I'll be right there in about a few minutes.
And he arrived just about 2 or 3 minutes after the object had taken off and left.
Well, the object was still about a couple of months up there whenever he arrived.
It was still, that's the direction it went. It went up over the top of the mountain. And we've heard several reports that it flew low, like it was dragging something, and we've heard some...
It was very low to the ground. At the time I was seeing it, it was very low to the ground, up to the perlite mill there, and then it started gaining altitude.
Now, also, it was reported to me that when you first drove up into this area and sighted this object, that the motors were running and it was going boo, 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 or some such sound as that. Is that correct?
I couldn't say because it happened so fast. I started running. I was scared.
Well, I don't blame you. The thought of it even scares me yet. Now, you did say that you saw 2 what appeared to be people dressed in white uniforms with, did they have helmets on like spacemen or anything?
No, sir, I wouldn't say that there were people. I saw something white coverall. That's what I could say.
They looked like there was something in white coverall.
Right.
But you couldn't identify them as actually being a human being as you and I are.
No, sir, okay.
But you didn't know whether they turned and saw you or what then?
Well, to my, I would say that this white object turned and saw me.
Were there 2 of them?
I would say there were 2 because one was in front and the other object was in back.
Did you have a chance to notice what kind of a doorway they had to this object, this flying object?
Didn't notice any doors, no.
And when it took off, it made a loud roaring sound. Is that?
Yes, sir. It's a very loud noise, roar sound.
And then after it got up in the air about 20 feet, well, the sound seemed to disappear.
The sound was disappeared and was very, very quiet. You could hear a pin drop there.
And now the markings it left on the ground, Now, the reports that I've had, and I haven't had a chance to go and take a look, and the winds yesterday have probably spoiled a lot of that anyway, was that there was deep indentations in the ground, approximately 10 inches wide and 6 to 8 inches deep, about 15 feet apart. Is that a correct report?
Well, I would say it was about 19 feet apart of the prints.
Uh-huh. And were there any other prints, like footprints around the area right after the takeoff, or when you were making the investigation?
There were some prints, but I wouldn't know if there were footprints or anything, just prints, I would say.
You couldn't identify them as actually being a footprint, just indentations like maybe somebody might have walked there, or somebody might have walked there.
Somebody walked around there because when I got there was nobody around there yet.
Now, there was, according to a report on one of the news, the television stations in Albuquerque, claimed that they had a call just about 5:30 in Albuquerque of a sighting of a flying object flying in this direction. Did you hear anything about that?
No, sir, I didn't.
Which, if that be true, means that someone in Albuquerque saw this object flying in this direction just prior to your sighting it. And which corroborates the fact that there was something here. Now, it's the feeling, I get the feeling, at least, Lonnie, of the people that I've talked to, and they were out in the area, that they are quite sure that something landed there and something took off from this spot because of not only the imprints that is left in the ground, but the fires that it started and the method of which the fire or the power that it was, whatever it was using, kind of spread itself as it took off. Is that right?
Right. I know there was something out there because I seen it.
And what was your immediate reaction as soon as you realized that this thing might be an object from outer space?
Well, I didn't think it would be an object from outer space because I don't believe in things like this from outer space.
Well, it was something that you'd never seen before, and
right.
It was enough to scare you to run in the other direction.
Well, what scared me was a loud noise in the flame that it had under it.
It had a large flame then as it took off. Was it a yellow flame or
It was a bluish, orange flame. I thought this object was going to blow out. That's why I started running back.
And did you notice whether these arms that it was sitting on retracted back into the object as it flew away, or you didn't have time? And I just running in the other direction at that time. I would have done too. Are there any other things about this sighting that you think our listening audience might be interested in, or something that you'll be allowed to tell us?
No, that's all I saw.
And did it disappear into the high sky after it got over around the perlite, or just
yes, sir, it flew low to the perlite mine, then from there on, it just so fast that you could barely do
straight up in the air.
You have to be paying attention to what you were looking at to see what it was doing.
Well, do you think we're going to get any more of them around here?
Hope not immediately.
Well, it was quite an interesting experience, I'm sure, and it has caused an awful lot of comment. Did the investigators that were called in make any comments at all in one direction or the other, with the exception of that they do not have any such object in this area?
Oh, they're still puzzled themselves, yes.
And there's been no report on the samplings they took of the area around there from the burning brush and the area that the blast hit the ground. But if I give them a clue as to what kind of power was being used on this.
No, sir, no.
Well, I think I've just about covered it here. Let's see. It wasn't dragging anything. We had a report that it was dragging something as it led.
No, I wouldn't say it was dragging nothing, just low to the ground.
And you can't think of anything else then about the sighting of this flying object that our listening audience might be interested in?
No, that's all I'll say now.
Well, Lonnie, I'm sure you've been getting an awful lot of questions and a lot of inquiry. I imagine you're beginning to get a little tired of it, actually, for so many people calling and asking you about it. maybe this will be one way to keep too many people from having you have to go through the story over and over again. Right. Well, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Mr. Lonnie Zamora. This is the gentleman, the Socorro patrolman, that Friday at around 10 minutes to 6, come up on an object, a flying object, an unidentified flying object, as the government prefers to call them.
Excuse me, Walter, I got some military people at the sheriff's office want to talk to me now. I believe they're from UFO. What you have is the military people that are here from UFO to talk to you right now and to ask you some more questions about this. And they have not in any way tried to indicate that they didn't want us to cover this type of a news. No, sir, I just don't know if I was going to come here and talk to you on the radio station. Just go right.
Well, that's fine, and we would be interested in knowing what they think about it if they will allow it, and after you get through talking to them, if you would call us back here at KSRC and to give us some of the information that they might allow you to let us broadcast.
We'd be glad to.
All right. And Mr. Zamora, I hope that you don't come upon any more of these objects unless we find out exactly what they are. So it's been a pleasure, Mr. Zamora, having you in our studios, and we want to thank you, and I know our listeners thank you, and this is expressed by the great number of cars that are out here in front of our studios just to get a glimpse of what we might call a Socorro celebrity right at the moment.
Thank you again, Mr. Zamora. It's been very nice having you in our KSRC studio. You've just been listening to a KSRC radio special featuring an interview with Mr. Lonnie Zamora, the patrolman here in Socorro that sighted a unidentified object that flew away when he drove up on it.
Louis Riddell, publisher of Socorro's El Defensor Chieftain newspaper, and editor Ted Rayner were escorted to the site early Saturday morning by New Mexico State Patrolman Sergeant Sam Chavez. After speaking to Zamora and inspecting the alleged landing site, they began writing an article about Lonnie's bizarre experience. The first issue of El Defensor Chieftain since Zamora's encounter was published with a headline which read, "Evidence of UFO landing here observed." The article is well written, and a copy can be found in the description below. Riddell, the paper's publisher, was in turn interviewed himself only a few days later and described his experience seeing the landing site the morning after.
Ray Stanford speaking. I'm at the office of the Defensor Chieftain in Socorro, New Mexico. I have just talked to a gentleman here who was on the site Saturday morning, some hours after the occurrence, while the imprints were still very clear. And I want to ask him some questions. I wonder if he could tell us his name first.
Louis Riddell. I'm publisher of the El Defensor Chieftain.
Regarding what was seen by you at the site, did you see the indentations or tracks while they were still very fresh?
Yeah, I was there early the next morning, and that was Saturday morning, and before hundreds of people had gotten a chance to obliterate all the tracks.
What was your impression of these tracks? Do you think they were made by a heavy object, or by a light object, or by digging out, or what?
I would say a heavy object coming down very slowly and made a 4 or 5 inch depression compared with the hard sand there in the draw.
And these were longer than they were wide?
About 12, I would guess, about 12 inches long and 3 or 4 inches wide.
And equally deep, perhaps running to the center in a wedge. Was that the description that was accurate on this that I've heard?
Well, probably a little deeper on the south side. I mean, the north side of the way it landed. From his description, the front of the plane, or the object, I'll put it that way, was facing south. And the way it landed on uneven ground, there seems to be heavy indentions on the south side, which indicates that more of the weight was there.
Yes, this would be logical to me because, as I recall from being there this morning, the south side is downhill. I mean, it kind of slants upward to the north, so there might actually be more weight on the south side if it were an object balancing, sitting on these legs. Was this your observation too?
Yes.
Now I hear there were two little indentations off to one side, to the west side, sort of parallel with with one of the lines made by two of the four legs. Did you see these two indentations yourself?
Yes, I did. Someone in the crowd, while it was on the four of us, one of them made a remark that they could possibly footprints, or if you want to describe it, more of a hoof print, but that wasn't the impression that I had of the thing, and we decided in our story, in our newspaper, that we wouldn't go into that too deeply. It sounded a little preposterous.
I see. How close were these to the line formed by the two nearest footprints, we'll call them left by the object, leg prints? How close were they to the line made by the two nearest footprints?
Well, they were practically in the center between the two indentions made by the legs on the west side.
Yes.
And they probably 36 inches, about a yard.
Were they in parallel with that line made by the two legs?
No, they were, yes, they were parallel, I'm sorry.
Yes.
On the 28th, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, scientific consultant for Project Blue Book, arrived in New Mexico and was met by Sergeant Moody. Quintanilla wrote, "Because of the pressure from the news media, I decided to send Dr. J. Allen Hynek, Project Blue Book consultant, to Kirtland to help with the investigation. I felt that Hynek could concentrate on Socorro, while Connor and Moody could check all other activity at the other bases in New Mexico." When Hynek finally met Zamora and Chavez, he found them to be very anti-Air Force after the treatment they received from the other Air Force investigators. Hynek wrote, "My original investigations directed toward breaking apart Zamora's account by seeking mutual contradictions in it, and also by seeking to establish Zamora as an unreliable witness, were fruitless. I was impressed by the high regard in which Zamora was held by his colleagues, and I personally am willing today to accept his testimony as genuine, particularly since it does fit a global pattern. I visited the site several days later and verified the landing marks and the charred plants. Chavez had, he told me in a long interview, verified the marks and the burned greasewood plants, which had still been smoldering at the time he first met Zamora at the site. Measurements taken at the site showed that the diagonals of the quadrilateral formed by the 4 landing marks intersected almost exactly at right angles. One theorem in geometry states that if the diagonals of a quadrilateral intersect at right angles, the midpoints of the sides of the quadrilateral lie on the circumference of a circle, and it is thus of considerable interest that the center of the circle so formed virtually coincided with the principal burn mark on the ground. Under certain conditions, the center of gravity of the craft would have been directly over the center of the circle, hence making the presence of the burn marks more significant. On successive visits, I continued my investigations into Zamora's credibility and traced the story of an unidentified witness who had stopped for gas just north of town. While at the gas station, he told of his encounter just south of town with a strange flying craft that was apparently in trouble and heading for a landing. He said that it must have been in trouble because he saw a squad car, Zamora's, going out across the sandy terrain toward it. He was unable to identify the craft as any normal aircraft. I tried my best at the time to induce the Air Force to make an intelligence problem of finding the missing witness, but they evinced no interest whatsoever. At the time, I thought that had this been a federal case involving narcotics or counterfeiting, the FBI would certainly have located the missing witness. Because it was merely a UFO case, the usual pattern of doing nothing was followed. unquote. By this time, Hynek knew that there was some sort of real, tangible aspect of the UFO phenomenon, but he did not believe in landings, much less close encounters of the third kind, a term he would later coin. Computer scientist, astronomer, and UFO investigator Jacques Vallée was Hynek's assistant at the time, and he has stated that the Socorro case was what convinced Hynek that UFO landings do actually take place. Hynek would later state that he accepts Zamora's testimony as genuine and accurate, especially given that it fits a global pattern. Though at the time, as he would later confess, he was being used by the Air Force in an attempt to discredit and generally downplay the UFO phenomenon. On Wednesday, April 29, 1964, Ray Stanford, UFO researcher and civilian investigator for NICAP, would visit the landing site. Stanford is considered a controversial figure by some due to some of his claims, so exercise your own judgment. But his work investigating the Zamora case has received high praise. He wrote a book about the case called Socorro Saucer and the Pentagon Pantry, which I would definitely recommend. He lays out the encounter in extreme detail as a detective would. Dr. Hynek stated, Stanford has transformed the case from a one-witness matter to a multi-witness case, and thus has accomplished what the Air Force failed to do. Referring back to his earlier statement, he urged the Air Force to locate and identify the additional witnesses, but they did nothing. Lonnie's daughter even stated in an interview that whenever asked, her father would recommend Stanford's book, citing it as an accurate account of his experience. He reportedly called Stanford's book the only one that got it right. Interestingly enough, Stanford was featured in the news in 2018 because he noticed a slab of stone with dinosaur tracks on it from over 100 million years ago while dropping his wife off for work at NASA Goddard. The stone, once fully excavated, revealed tracks from over 70 different species, including dinosaurs and mammals. It later became the subject of a study which stated the stone had, quote, one of the highest track densities and diversities ever reported, unquote. Between Phoenix and Socorro, Stanford was able to contact Zamora and had a short conversation with him over the phone. Zamora agreed to speak with Stanford when he got off duty. Stanford originally set out to Socorro after hearing the basic details of Zamora's encounter, suspecting that he will most likely unravel a hoax. Stanford wrote, quote, thinking back over my UFO investigations in the past 12 years, it now appeared that if this case were what it seemed to be, the nation might have experienced its most reliably reported UFO landing. Yet the humanoids were the hard pill to swallow. In past years, I had delighted in exposing hoaxed UFO accounts. For a while back, in 1958 and 59, I had whole camps of the more liberal and subjective UFO believers disliking me for exposing the hoaxes of certain well-known contactees, but this case seemed far different. It was already evident that Zamora would rather it had never happened. He certainly was not the variety of man who wanted to be accused of seeing little green men. He briefly met Zamora in person at the Socorro Police Department, but was unable to get the full interview he wanted. Stanford introduced himself to Zamora and explained that he was investigating on behalf of NICAP and sought only to get the most accurate account of Zamora's experience as possible. Quote, whether Zamora believed that I was truly interested in facts only, or whether he thought I merely wanted a sensational story from the horse's mouth, I was never able to determine. However, he did say that he had heard of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, for which I was investigating the case, and that he would try to answer my questions. Zamora told Stanford that, unfortunately, he would have to postpone his interview because Dr. Hynek still needed to question him further. Stanford arrived at the Socorro Police Department early the following morning so that he could interview the other police officers and gauge their reactions for himself. All of the police officers that Stanford spoke with said that they believed Lonnie and that he would not fabricate such a story. When he asked about Zamora, he was told that Zamora was off duty at the time. Quote, "The daytime police dispatcher, Mike Martinez, confided to me, Lonnie's at the point now where he'll just about deny that he saw anybody next to that whatchamacallit out there last Friday, but don't ever think he didn't. Several of the officers were out there real soon after that thing flew off. He told us that those two figures in white, he said they looked like children, had been right there beside that thing." After some hesitation, Martinez told Stanford that Zamora and the others were at the landing site. Stanford went to the landing site and met with Dr. Hynek, Lonnie Zamora, and Officer Chavez. The four of them stood and discussed the incident for a few moments before descending into the ravine to see the landing site for themselves. Hynek wanted to take samples of the landing site, of the burned brush, the soil, and anything else of relevance. Hynek stated that Zamora reenacted the series of events during the investigation. Quote, "He showed me just how he had run from the scene, where he had hit the car and knocked off his glasses, and how he had crouched with his arm across his eyes, glancing backward to see what was happening. I examined the site carefully and took photographs. I also made a point of wandering pretty far afield to see if I could spot similar landing marks in the area." Hynek took samples of scorched vegetation, burned paper, soil, anything which may be of scientific value. Zamora then noted something at the landing site which everyone else neglected. Quote, "During the course of further conversation with Hynek and I, Zamora had been standing very near the northwestern landing gear imprint. I noticed that at times he had been staring at the imprint while we talked. Suddenly, he bent over and looked at it closely. Then he excitedly turned and motioned Hynek and me closer. Look here," Zamora exclaimed, pointing to a large stone embedded in the ground on the northeast edge of the imprint. "The object's foot must have hit this rock. It looks like it's been scraped and broken right here along the edge of the imprint." I tried to conceal my interest in Zamora's discovery. Surely, I reasoned, if the object's landing gear had pressed so hard on a rock as to break the edge of it, there must be some trace, even if minute, of metal or foreign substance scraped off onto the surface of that rock. My first reaction was to immediately stoop down and examine the rock, but better judgment took over. I glanced at Hynek. Apparently, his logic was not following the same path as mine. An absent-minded, yes, a heavy object might do that, was his only reaction. Nearly 3 years later, he was to express sincere puzzlement as to why the possibility or even the likelihood of foreign matter on the broken rock never dawned on him at the time. Sensing that Hynek was not going to do anything about the rock, I realized that I had better not do anything that would focus his attention on it, should there be found any metal scrapings on that stone from the landing gear of the object. Hynek would immediately assume custody over that evidence, and it would fall into the hands of the Air Force. I desired to make doubly sure that Hynek would pay no further attention to the rock. For that reason, I reminded the astronomer that he was due at a press conference at the Rio Motel in 20 minutes. Unquote. Stanford kept the discovery in his mind as the group headed to the Rio Motel for Hynek's press conference. He was anxious to return as fast as possible to obtain the possible physical evidence of the landing before the Air Force realized. Hynek and the others met with Walter Schroed of KSRC Radio at the Rio Motel. Hynek's interview was recorded by Ray Stanford in Hynek's motel room. They were also joined by other members of the Air Force.
I certainly believe that Lonnie Zamora had a most interesting and significant experience, and I'm particularly interested in the tracks that were left and in the analysis of the samples of material from those tracks. And until you know more about it, all I can say about it
disappointingly to you, perhaps, is simply that I'm as puzzled as you are.
If your findings on this, after you run the analysis on the specimens that you've taken, would you be at liberty to advise the public as to just what they were?
Yes, absolutely. There's no reason why not. I think in general, there's been a feeling that the Air Force wants to hide things. And this is, at least in my experience as consultant for them, I have not come across that. For instance, here's one example. I was called by the Pentagon this morning, and there's an Associated Press report out to the effect that some Air Force person had told Mr. Zamora not to say anything about the lettering. And I was asked specifically to find out whether this statement had been made, who made it, and all that sort of thing. Zamora tells me that no one, Air Force or no one else, told him not to say anything about it. But this is how these rumors get started. Someone says the Air Force says clam up, and this was simply, apparently, not the case, according to Mr. Zamora. So I was very happy to find that out.
Well, now about this marking, could you tell us how he described the marking and what the marking was?
Yes, I see no reason why not. He described it to me as an inverted V with a sort of a bar across it. And as he described it and drew it, the thing I was reminded of is a typical brand you have, a cattle brand. As though whatever the instrument, whatever the device was, as though somebody had branded it as you might brand a cattle.
And about the color of this object, how did he describe the color?
Not in any great detail. The color was indicated as primarily whitish, and no specific markings other than the inverted V.
Here, Hynek lies and says that he is investigating as a civilian, not on official business. We know that he was here on official Blue Book business, as other Air Force officials, like Captain Holder, explicitly stated that Hynek was dispatched by the Air Force to investigate the Socorro case. Hynek would later admit this fact in his own book years later. Quote, "I was sent by Blue Book to Socorro, New Mexico, as an official investigator." Unquote. Hynek also claims that no one tried to silence Zamora. We have already demonstrated that Captain Holder, as well as FBI agent Burns, both told Lonnie not to talk about key aspects of his encounter. We even hear Lonnie say so in his interview with Walter Schrode a few days prior. After the interview concluded, Schrode and Stanford remained with Hynek in his motel room for around 30 minutes. Stanford writes, "Before Schrode and I left, there was some almost heated verbal exchange with Major Connor. I asked the astronomer why he had stated in the interview that Zamora said no one had told him not to describe the markings he saw on the side of the object. I informed him that both Schrode and I had tape recordings of an earlier KSRC interview, wherein Zamora plainly answered Schrode's request for a description of the red marking on the craft's side with, 'No, sir, I couldn't tell you that because they still don't want me to say anything about the markings.'" Instead of Hynek, to whom I addressed the question, answering for what he had just said in the interview, Major Connor broke in. Let's suppose a military officer told him something like, "I think if I were you, I wouldn't describe the symbol you saw on the side of the device to anyone else except official investigators." This might have caused Zamora to think he was told not to talk about it, Connor said. "That's a very interesting possibility, Major," I said, "but can you answer why an officer would tell Zamora such, unless the intention were to keep the symbol's description from becoming public knowledge? And 2, why do you suggest that this was what happened, unless you have been told either by Zamora or by the military officer involved?" The Major was visibly shocked that I would go as far as to pin him down to specifics. His words now became slow and measured. "Well, you see, I told him that." Schrode and I exchanged glances. During the interview, Hynek had just told us and the public that the Pentagon wanted him to discover what officer, if any, suggested Zamora withhold data from the public. I looked over at Hynek, the man whom the Pentagon had urgently asked to locate the officer responsible for Zamora's silence. The man whom the Pentagon had urgently asked to locate the officer responsible for Zamora's silence did not look very surprised at Connor's confession. Pointing at the Major and speaking to Hynek, I said, "Well, there is the man the Pentagon wants you to locate." Connor broke in again. "Let's not get sidetracked into official procedures." I was quick to take him up on that statement. "Do you mean that you were expressing official policy or procedure in putting the bug in Lonnie's ear, not to talk about the markings?" The Major shifted nervously in his chair. He said, "Let's suppose that it was someone else, some other officer, who told Zamora that. I just recalled, in fact, that it was another officer. My memories got crossed up for a moment. It wasn't me, but let's get off this subject. Official policy doesn't concern you." After Hynek's press conference, Stanford rushed to reinvestigate the landing site. He was still focused on the discovery of the rock, which the craft's leg broke. He returned alone and examined the rock. It appeared to have metallic scrapings on it from the craft's landing gear. He pulled the rock fully out of the ground and wrapped it up to contain the metallic scrapings. Part of him was worried that he could face legal penalties for taking the rock and the possible physical evidence if the Air Force realized. Stanford chose to keep quiet about it until he left Socorro and hid the rock inside his car. Only a few hours later, Stanford met with Walter Schroed at a Socorro restaurant with two women who claimed to be auditory witnesses of the landing and takeoff of the craft. Schroed introduced Stanford to the two women, who lived on the south side of Socorro, only a few blocks from the landing site. Stanford asked the women if they saw the object. They explained that just before 6 o'clock, they, as well as their neighbors, heard a loud, bizarre roar. Quote, "I was getting supper. I usually have it on the table by 6. It was nearly on the table when this roar started. Then I stopped and asked myself, 'That's funny, what's that?' Then I went on putting things on the table. Then in a minute, it started again. I said to myself, 'That thing's overhead.' Then I went to the south window and looked up. That's when I could tell it was down south. The thing stopped roaring then, so I went back and got everything on the table. Nobody else in the house paid it as much attention as I did. I guess it was because I was nearest that south window that was open and heard it loudest. When we heard about what happened to Lonnie, I said, 'Well, I heard that thing myself.' They specified that many of their neighbors also heard the object. Quote, 'When it landed and when it took off, we heard two different roars. Maybe there was a minute or so between them, so we know it landed and then took off pretty soon, just like Lonnie tells us.' Later, a member of the Socorro Police Department told Stanford that there were, quote, 'hundreds' who heard the strange roar of the craft. However, Stanford clarifies that he only ever personally interviewed the two women who Schroed introduced him to. On Thursday, Stanford went to the sheriff's office, where he was met by Lonnie, as they had planned. Stanford noted that Lonnie seemed tense and troubled by the amount of time he'd spent speaking to various investigators and researchers. Lonnie was also nervous to speak freely about his encounter, given the recommendations he received from the Army and the FBI to keep quiet about the craft's symbol and the humanoids. This, however, was one of the burning questions Stanford had for Lonnie. This interview is where Zamora first admitted that it was Captain Holder who told him to keep quiet. Despite this admission, Zamora still refused to describe the insignia he saw on the craft to Stanford. Shortly after Zamora left, Stanford overheard another police officer who was fed up with Dr. Hynek's treatment of Lonnie's case. Quote, "If those Pentagon boys keep sending out people like Hynek when somebody sees something, there isn't nobody in this country gonna believe Uncle Sam about anything in a few years. We don't care if one of them things lands right here on top of us next time. We're not gonna tell them Air Force or other military people nothing about it." Unquote. Following this, Stanford began on his way back to Phoenix when something unexpected took place. Nearly 50 miles west of Socorro, Stanford claims that he had a sighting of his own. Quote, "During the trip from Phoenix to Socorro, a telephoto lens had been attached to my 35mm Argus C3 camera. It was loaded with color film, and I felt reasonably prepared just in case another UFO should arrive in the Socorro area while I was there. Once at the landing site, I had removed the telephoto lens in favor of a standard focal-length lens. Since no UFOs had appeared in the area during the considerable time I had been there, and there seemed little chance of seeing one on the way back to Phoenix, I decided not to take time to replace the standard lens in favor of the telephoto. Tossing the camera in the back seat, I headed for home, all the while preoccupied with evaluating all I had seen and heard over the past few days. Suddenly, at 10:22 a.m., about 48 miles west of Socorro, directly ahead of me over the western horizon, something strange popped into view from behind a cloud. The object was moving rapidly northward. It seemed to be a number of miles away, although it gave me the impression of being rather large. From my position, it looked elongated, or somewhat cigar-shaped, or ellipsoidal, with its longitudinal axis tilted very definitely at an estimated 10 to 12 degree angle relative to both the horizon and its line of motion. It immediately reminded me of the tilt Zamora had seen in the landed object on the prior Friday. I could think of no ordinary craft that could move so rapidly with its body tilted relative to the direction of travel, as if oblivious to the laws of aerodynamics. Even more strange than that was the division of the elongated body of the object into two distinct halves, one of which displayed a metallic silvery appearance, while the back half looked as if it were surrounded in a shimmering, transparent, distinctly deep blue light. The angular velocity of the object seemed in excess of an ordinary jet aircraft at the minimum apparent distance, of which I was able to make a fairly objective estimate, due to the passage of the object behind various drifting clouds on the western horizon. No contrail was seen." Unquote. After his sighting, Stanford was shocked. He considered returning to Socorro to speak with Walter Schrode again. He thought that perhaps other witnesses could be located if Schrode asked over the radio for witnesses to come forth and give their testimony. Instead of driving back to Socorro, Stanford drove west towards the New Mexico border and called Schrode from the first telephone he could find. Walter took notes on Stanford's alleged experience, but decided against calling for witnesses on the radio. He decided to simply wait and see if any witnesses came forward. Stanford continued west and found himself at a cattle inspection station, where two men were sitting in a parked car facing the direction of his sighting. He asked them if they saw anything in the sky, and they said no. The following afternoon, a couple came by the KSRC radio station and described seeing a UFO to Schrode. Their description matched Stanford's nearly exactly. When Stanford returned to Phoenix, he began compiling his report on the Socorro case for NICAP. Soon after, he turned his attention back to the rock which he had spirited away from the landing site. Quote, "Finally, I decided to remove the heavy rock, which was still wrapped in newspapers beneath the driver's seat of my car. Because of the excitement of my photographically recorded UFO sighting on the way back to Phoenix, and the need to prepare the NICAP report, the possible importance of the rock as a repository of physical evidence in the Socorro case had momentarily slipped my mind, even though, It had been uppermost in my thoughts at the time I had taken it from the site. Removing the rock from the car, I unwrapped it carefully and thoroughly inspected the newspapers to be sure no foreign metallic evidence had fallen off the rock. I could hardly believe my eyes. All along the edge of the stone, where the edge of the landing gear had passed on its way to a firm footing in the earth, were small fragments and rolled-up shavings of brilliant metal. Stanford soon called Richard Hall of NICAP to inform him of the possible physical evidence of the Socorro landing which was in his possession. Especially at this time, physical evidence of UFOs was incredibly rare, especially evidence which was in the hands of the public. Hall was extremely interested in the Socorro material, and Stanford asked him how they should go about having a professional third party analyze the metal. Later, Stanford received a letter from Hall stating that he had spoken with Dr. Henry E. Frankel, a metallurgist and materials engineer from NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, who, quote, offered to analyze any materials for us on an unofficial basis because he could not justify the use of expensive equipment unless something definitely and significantly different turned up. In that case, he would publicize it and carry it to the top, unquote. Dr. Frankel gave Hall a tour of his laboratories, which housed an electron microscope, UV and IR spectrometers, and many other instruments. A Washington Post article published at the time of Dr. Frankel's death stated, Dr. Frankel, who worked at NASA in the 1960s and 70s, was a leader in the study of metals in exotic environments such as space. At the time of his death, he was chief scientist of orbital research. He started at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in 1960, shortly before Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit the Earth in spaceflight. At Goddard, Dr. Frankel explored how temperature extremes and other factors affected metal in space. He started a materials research and development branch at Goddard, and eventually assembled a team of more than 100 people who specialized in subjects such as metallography and organic analysis. His materials branch was later incorporated into Goddard's Engineering Physics Division, which he led. The division was responsible for solving quality control problems related to materials for the Apollo missions and other NASA programs. The article states that he also worked at the Naval Research Laboratory and what was then the National Bureau of Standards during the 1950s. He published more than 75 papers during his academic career. On July 24, 1964, Stanford and Hall arrived at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center with the Socorro material inside of a large, triple-walled metal cylinder. They met Dr. Frankel in his office, and Stanford explained the Socorro case, providing photos of the landing site, as well as 2 naval operations documents which reference UFOs and flying discs. Stanford asked Dr. Frankel to confirm that he would be willing to publicly document his findings, possibly in a congressional hearing, and Frankel agreed. Dr. Frankel then led the group into one of his labs to analyze the material. Frankel placed the rock with its metallic shavings carefully under a microscope. Quote, some of the particles look like they may have been in a molten state when scraped onto the rock, unquote. They all took turns looking over the rock with its various metallic shavings scattered around the rock's surface. After examining the material, one of the NASA technicians asked Dr. Frankel if he wanted him to remove the metallic substance from the rock's surface. Stanford interjected, quote, wait, before you start doing that, I request that you leave 1/2 of the particles on the stone's surface so that I retain half of the evidence. Is that satisfactory, Dr. Frankel? I felt strange asking him what could be done with my evidence, but the circumstances made that approach seem appropriate. Yes, Dr. Frankel answered. We will do that. Now, why don't you fellows go over to the cafeteria and have lunch? Their food is very good. while he removes the particles we need for analysis. I'll join you there in a little while. It's just a bit north from this building, across the parking lot." Unquote. Dr. Frankel never joined the others for lunch. Afterwards, Stanford returned to the laboratory to collect his half of the evidence and found that the place was now abandoned. Eventually, he found a technician who claimed Frankel left him in charge. Stanford explained their situation and asked the technician if he could bring him his half of the Socorro material. As he handed it to me, I was able to carefully observe it in the bright light inside the room. The whole thing had been scraped clean. Someone had gone over that rock with the equivalent of a fine-toothed comb. There was nothing, not a speck of the metal left. Even the very few tiny particles that I had known were rather well hidden had been removed. Stanford demanded an explanation from the technician, who insisted that half of the particles were still on the rock, despite their absence. Hall cautioned Stanford and told him not to pursue the technician because it would make a bad name for NICAP. Quote, "There's no conspiracy. Maybe they just found out they would need all the metal for proper analysis." When Frankel returned, Stanford said, quote, "I noticed there is no metal visible on the rock now. Not to the naked eye, anyhow, but I guess you needed about all of it for the tests you will make." "Well, we tried to leave you some, but we also had to get enough to make an accurate analysis," Frankel replied. "The sample will be placed under radiation this afternoon, where it will remain the entire weekend. Monday, we will remove it for X-ray diffraction tests. That should tell us the elements which it contains." Unquote. Dr. Frankel promised to call Stanford with the results. Several days later, when he finally did call Stanford back, he stated, quote, "We have analyzed the particles that were clinging to the rock's surface. The particles are comprised of a material that could not occur naturally. Specifically, it consists predominantly of two metallic elements, zinc and iron, with minute traces of other elements, and there is something that is rather exciting about the zinc-iron alloy, of which we find the particles to consist. Our charts of all alloys known to be manufactured on Earth, the USSR included, do not show any alloy of the specific combination or ratio of the two main elements involved here. This finding definitely strengthens the case that might be made for an extraterrestrial origin of the Socorro object." "You mean," I asked, "that your findings are certain enough that you would go before, say, a congressional hearing and actually tell about this zinc-iron alloy, mentioning the fact that it apparently is not presently manufactured on Earth?" "Our charts here at Goddard are the most complete in the world, I would say," Frankel replied. "At least they are the final authority as far as anyone can determine. I am virtually certain that the alloy involved here is not manufactured anywhere on Earth. Yes, I would make a statement to that effect, if you need it." Unquote. Frankel further explained that there was further testing to be done, which would identify other elements found only in very small percentages. He told Stanford to call back in a week and he would have the results. Stanford called back on August 5th and was told that Dr. Frankel was not available and to call back the next day. He called back the next day and was told that Dr. Frankel was not available and to call back in a week. Stanford asked if Frankel could arrange a specific time tomorrow when he could call and speak to him. The secretary put Stanford on hold and returned to tell him that Dr. Frankel cannot speak to him at any time tomorrow and to call back Monday. On Monday, the secretary told Stanford that Dr. Frankel was, quote, "unprepared at this time to discuss the information you are calling about," unquote. Stanford continued trying to contact Dr. Frankel's office day after day, week after week, and it became clear that for some reason he would not be able to speak with the scientist. When Stanford called back on August 20th, he was redirected not to Dr. Frankel, but to a different scientist who stated, quote, "I have been appointed to call you and report the official conclusion of the Socorro sample analysis. Dr. Frankel is no longer involved with the matter, so in response to your repeated inquiries, I want to tell you the results of the analysis. Everything you were told earlier by Dr. Frankel was a mistake. The sample was determined to be silica." Unquote. Remember, when Dr. Frankel agreed to analyze the materials, it was on an unofficial basis. Yet a different NASA scientist was appointed to give Stanford the official conclusion on the Socorro material. It became apparent to Stanford that there was a cover-up taking place. In 1967, Stanford received an invitation from Dr. Hynek to attend a presentation he was giving at Northwestern University because Hynek wanted to speak to Stanford. After the lecture, the two spoke for a long time before Hynek asked Stanford what happened to the Socorro material which he took to Goddard for analysis. Stanford was surprised by the question, as he had no idea how Hynek learned that he ever took the rock from the landing site. He was especially confused that Hynek knew the Socorro material was analyzed at Goddard, a fact which had not been published at the time. Hynek stated, quote, "I am familiar with the analysis techniques involved. Silica could not be mistaken for a zinc-iron alloy. They haven't given you the truth. I would accept Frankel's original report and forget the later disclaimer." Stanford was not the only one to describe the physical evidence allegedly taken by NASA. In Forbidden Science 5 by Jacques Vallée, we gained some further insight on Stanford's Socorro sample, which was taken by NASA. Dr. Kit Green, neuroimaging expert and CIA expert on anomalous health incidents, confirmed to Jacques Vallée that the sample was not from this Earth. Quote, "Prompted by the ongoing correspondence with Eric and Colm, I have been rereading Ray Stanford's book on Socorro. The copy I have belonged to Allen Hynek and includes his precious annotations. Ray had picked up a rock at Socorro that bore traces of metal abrasions from the landing gear of the landed UFO, which turned out to be significant. In August 1964, a scientist at NASA Goddard examined the samples under a microscope and told Stanford that the analysis revealed that the slivers consisted of zinc and iron in an unusual ratio. Yet by the time Ray Stanford was able to contact Goddard again, he was told the sample was determined to be silica. This was later confirmed in a letter on NASA stationery sent to Richard Hall at the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. The cover-up at work, once again using the old channels. In our inner circle, further information has come to light. Ray's wife works at Goddard in the PR office. In the hallways, she heard a returning retiree be introduced to someone else with great pride as the guy who stole the Socorro sample. There are conflicting rumors about these samples showing up at another lab sometime in 1982. They had been analyzed at Los Alamos under a metallurgical services contract. The verdict: not any aluminum titanium alloy we ever saw from this Earth. Kit's recollection is that the later re-examination of these samples, circa 1992, confirmed the fact that the main constituents were definitely titanium and aluminum. Stanford returned to Socorro 4 months later, on Wednesday, August 26th, hoping to speak with Zamora again. However, this time, he learned something shocking, which has flown under the radar, even to most UFO researchers. Stanford came back to the Socorro Police Department looking for Zamora and spoke to Mike Martinez at the front desk. They spoke about Lonnie's encounter, and Martinez told Stanford that since the incident took place, officials from the Pentagon had returned time and time again to speak with Zamora. Quote, "There's something that bothers us about the officials that have been here talking to Lonnie about this. You know, the military officers and Hynek, and everybody else they send in to talk to Lonnie. Those guys come here, some of them have been back several times, and they talk real serious in some closed room with him. They don't seem to want anybody else to know what they talk to him about, and some of them are real brains, like that guy Hynek. Then they come out and leave town right away. If anybody asks them about it, they make light, like one of them said, "Oh, there must be some simple explanation, if we knew what it was." If they don't believe that thing was real, why do they keep coming so often to talk to Lonnie again? That's why we don't tell any of them anymore when the UFOs come around or land. You mean that UFOs have been seen landing around here since April 24th? Yes, there have been several landings that we know happened. One evening, 6 or 7 weeks ago, a red glowing thing landed right near town, just across east of the railroad and canal. Several people got real scared and they called us. We sent a car out to investigate, and when it got over near where the thing was landed, it took off. Did the policemen who were sent over there see it too? I asked. Yes, Martinez replied. They saw it, and then it took off. And you say there have been other landings too? Well, yes. There may even have been more than one at a place high up in the mountains west of town. Over there in the area of Baldy, that's one of the big mountains west of town. I guess Bert first reported it to us a week or two before, then one landed right over there east of the canal. It came down in between some of those high peaks up in that area. Seems like they've seen it come down in that same place several times. I think it has always been seen up there at night. Some people are beginning to wonder if it's got a base up there and is coming home to roost." Unquote. Soon enough, Lonnie arrived to speak with Stanford. Stanford noted that Lonnie seemed much more relaxed now compared to his demeanor following the encounter. Stanford wanted to tell Zamora about the analysis and cover-up of the Socorro material. He also wanted to ask Zamora for any details about his encounter, which he had not yet shared. After explaining the cover-up of the Socorro material, Zamora seemed much more receptive to Stanford's questioning and began to open up more. Zamora said, quote, "I'd been thinking, from the way some of the officials have questioned me, that they might figure the thing I saw was from out there, from some other planet or something." "Does that mean, Lonnie," I asked immediately, "that you think the thing and its operators you saw might have come from some other planet and not from the Earth?" Lonnie answered, "I didn't believe in, anything that might be living out there. Never did believe that those flying saucers came from other planets either. Never did believe in them. Then this thing happened, and I've been thinking about it. From the officials I've talked to, don't see how it could have been anything that we made. Seemed like they might know that too. I'd say it might be from space. Yes, I don't know, but you might say that. They know that there was something funny about that thing that came down out there. When Hynek was back here to see me recently, he told me something that has got them puzzled. He said it might be some kind of a key to how the thing was powered. I had asked Hynek what had ever happened to those pictures Ted Jordan took of the landing site just a few minutes after that thing had left. The Air Force took the film. They promised Ted to send it back to him soon. Well, Ted is kind of mad about the fact that they said they'd either send him those pictures back or else send him some payment for the film, and they haven't. So I asked Hynek why the Air Force hadn't kept their promise to Ted. Hynek said that they never sent the film back to Ted because it wouldn't have done him any good. He said the Air Force developed the film, but that every shot had turned black or fogged and ruined or something by some force they couldn't understand. Maybe like atomic radiation. He said that was too important a finding to let that film go back to Ted. Hynek thought that it might give some idea how that thing I saw was powered or something, but he didn't know just what kind of power might be involved yet. Stanford also stated that during June of 1976, he was visited by Hynek after he read the manuscript of his book on the Socorro case. Hynek openly confirmed that the U.S. Air Force had told him that Jordan's film was damaged, as if by radiation. Apparently still present at the site several minutes after the takeoff of the object. Hynek speculated that the radiation left behind by the object, which damaged Jordan's film, may be a clue as to the type of energy utilized by the UAP's propulsion. We know now that many UFOs do seem to utilize forms of exotic energy in their propulsion systems. Many witnesses, including military pilots, have received radiation burns from UFOs, as I've discussed previously on the channel. There is some interesting lost media related to this case, separate from the suppressed photographs we discussed earlier. As it turns out, there was a 1965 documentary film which prominently featured the Socorro encounter called Phenomena 7.7. The film was said to be the culmination of 20 years of UFO research by Dr. Frank Stranges, the filmmaker. It included an interview with Zamora and footage of the landing site in full color right after his encounter. In 1966, the LA Times listed filmmaker clergyman Dr. Frank Stranges as an authority on flying saucers and revealed that the title of the film, Phenomena 7.7, was derived from a U.S. Air Force report which estimated that nearly 8% of all unidentified flying object sightings defied explanation. The article also states that Stranges became interested in UFOs after his college roommate, who was in the U.S. Marines, claimed to have had an encounter. Location scenes were reportedly filmed in Brazil and Socorro, New Mexico, at the site of Lonnie Zamora's encounter. On June 20th, 1966, LAT reported that, quote, a local film laboratory accidentally delivered the print to a major aircraft company. After passing the print through several departments, bewildered employees assumed it contained classified information and stored it in a vault. Movie Tech eventually retrieved the print and the screening proceeded on schedule. If this is true, why would a major aircraft company assume that this UFO documentary contains classified information? The film was produced by Empire Studios and did premiere in Socorro, New Mexico, but distribution has been extremely limited. Supposedly, after the film's extremely limited release, it was only shown during some of Dr. Stranges' lectures. UFO investigator and documentary filmmaker James Fox learned of Phenomena 7.7 while working on his own movie, The Phenomenon. He wanted to include some of the full-color interview with Zamora and the footage of the landing site in his own film. Turner Classic Movies occasionally lists the film as part of its classic lineup. Fox thought he might find the film in their archives. Quote, I contacted the head of Turner Classics and had an archivist go into the vault. They found an empty sleeve with the name of the film, but unfortunately, the contents, once opened, was empty. On a Google Groups thread from March 19, 2014, users collectively began to search for the film, prompted by Fox's hunt for it. A user on the thread, UFO researcher Isaac Coy, found that Strange's wife claimed to be in possession of the original 3.5mm film. When Dr. Stranges passed away, his wife Julie offered to allow James Fox to search through the doctor's storage facilities to find the film. James Fox stated, I went as far as digging through 2 separate storage facilities in Southern California with his widow crying while I rummaged through her dead husband's affairs. She offered and I accepted. Needless to say, after 4 days, I couldn't find the master. As of this recording, the film has yet to surface. Though most are unaware of the full story of the Socorro incident, some skeptics have tried to dismiss the Socorro case as a mere sighting of a weather balloon. Even if we ignore all the details, which would make it apparent that the Socorro object was not a balloon, we actually know that it could not have been a balloon. Various weather reports from that day indicate that there were 25 to 30 mile per hour winds at that time, blowing south-southwest. This wind data also confirms Zamora's account of the winds at the time. In his testimony, he said he could tell the wind was blowing south-southwest, judging from the way dust flew off of his car's tires. Later, when the object flew away, it went against the wind. It hovered and then flew against the wind, unlike a balloon. Some have suggested that the object was actually an experimental lunar lander. Major Quintanilla was convinced that some sort of physical craft landed and flew away from Zamora. In his memoir, he wrote, "I checked the Holloman Air Force Base Balloon Control Center for balloon activity. All local weather stations and Air Force bases in New Mexico were checked for release of weather balloons. Helicopter activity was checked throughout the state. Government and private aircraft were checked. The Reconnaissance Division in the Pentagon was checked. I checked with the Immigration Division, hoping they might help. Finally, I was at my wit's end, so I told Marilyn, get me the White House command post. She looked at me like I was nuts. I said, yes, Marilyn, the White House command post. She never asked me a question. She just started dialing. I was afraid she would ask me how she could reach them, but she didn't. It took her 5 or 6 calls, but she got me the command post. A major general answered, and I explained to him my situation. He was very sympathetic, but offhand, he couldn't recall any type of activity in my area of interest. However, he'd check and call me back. 15 minutes later, the general called back and told me that the only activity he had was some U-2 flights. That was no help, so I thanked him for his cooperation and put my thinking cap on again. I was determined to solve the case, and come hell or high water, I was going to find the vehicle, or the stimulus. I decided that it was imperative for me to talk to the base commander at Holloman Air Force Base. I wanted to interview the base commander at length about special activities from his base. I needed help to pull this off, so I called Lieutenant Colonel Maston Jacks at SAFOI. I told him what I wanted to do, and he asked, "Do you think it'll do any good?" I replied, "If there is an answer to this case, it has to be in some hangar at Holloman." He went to work from his position at the Pentagon, and the approval for my visit came through. Colonel Garman was the base commander during my visit. He was most cooperative, and told me that I could go anywhere and visit any activity which interested me. I went from one end of the base to the other. I spent 4 days talking to everybody I could, and spent almost a whole day with the downrange controllers at the White Sands Missile Range. I left Holloman dejected, and convinced that the answer to Zamora's experience did not originate and terminate at that base. On my way back to Wright-Patterson, I hit upon an idea. Why not a lunar landing vehicle? I knew that some research had been done at Wright-Patterson, so as soon as I got back, I asked for some briefings. The briefings were extremely informative, but the lunar landers were not operational in April 1964. I got the names of the companies that were doing research in this field, and I started writing letters. The companies were most cooperative, but their answers were all negative." Unquote. Philip J. Klass, a professional debunker in his time, wrote that this case was a conspiracy by the town to promote tourism. In order for this to be possible, the conspiracy would have to include the mayor of Socorro, the town council, the Air Force, the FBI, the Army, the Socorro Police Department, as well as other government agencies for the events to play out the way they did. On top of this, none of the town council members were aware of the Keyes and Kratzer sighting, which coincided with the main Socorro incident. All of the facts point to the opposite, including all the declassified files and internal documentation of the investigation itself. If this was the case, then it was a failure, as Socorro remains a small town, much like it was in the 1960s. Dr. Hynek also thoroughly dismantled the idea that the Socorro sighting was a hoax or a hallucination. In a letter to astronomer Donald Menzel, Dr. Hynek wrote, quote, "With respect to the Socorro case, I wish I could substantiate the idea that it was a hoax or a hallucination. Unfortunately, I cannot. I have talked at length with the principals in the sighting, and unless my knowledge of human nature is utterly out of phase, I would feel that Zamora is incapable of perpetrating a hoax. He is simply a good solid cop, whose two early comments are in themselves quite revealing. The first was to ask his superior whether he should first talk to his priest, and his second was that he resented the whole thing because it prevented him from getting his quota of speeders that day. He is not imaginative, sticks solidly to business, and is far from talkative. Major Quintanilla is convinced that the Socorro sighting is neither a hoax nor a hallucination, but he feels that perhaps some sort of test object might have been going on. However, there is no record of such, even though he has tried to track this down through White Sands, Holloman Air Force Base, and a few others. I would like to go along with the hallucination idea if it weren't for the marks and the burned patches. I arrived there several days afterwards, of course, but the marks had been preserved, and I have the word of 9 witnesses who saw the marks within hours of the incident, who tell me that the center of the marks were moist as though the topsoil had been freshly pushed aside. The 4 marks, when plotted out, lie such that the diagonals intersect at exactly 90 degrees, which may or may not be significant." Unquote. If there is nothing to this, if it was just a weather balloon or any other prosaic stimuli, why did the elements of the United States government react to the Socorro case the way they did? The incident was investigated by the police, the Army, Air Force, and the FBI, even conspired to censor and contain the story to the extent that they could. Lonnie was essentially intimidated by the Army and the FBI to keep quiet about the strange symbol on the craft and the small figures he saw outside of it. Even NASA is alleged to have taken part in this cover-up. Why would these government agencies react the way they did if there is nothing to see here? The FBI files on the Socorro case reveal that they were interested in another, very similar case which occurred in the same time frame. According to various newspapers, there was a series of UFO sightings following the Socorro incident. Many of these newspaper clippings are in the Blue Book files. Some of these incidents, such as the alleged Holloman Air Force Base landing, are too large for the scope of this video. An FBI document regarding the Socorro incident, which was sent to the director, mentions that another incident occurred soon after Lonnie's encounter. The document states that a witness was visiting his father at La Madera and went out to tend to some noisy horses at about 1 a.m. when he noticed something 300 feet from the house. It was shaped like a butane tank. It was 12 to 14 feet high and as long as a telephone pole. A blue-white flame appeared to come out of the object through portholes. The witness watched the scene for a minute until the flame went out. After a moment, the witness told his father of the sighting, who just laughed at him. But in the morning, he returned to the site and found burn marks in the area. Later that day, he reported it to a state police officer. Police and Air Force investigators noted burn marks in the area, as well as indentations in the ground. Ultimately, the case was explained by Blue Book as a drunk witness mistaking a burning garbage pile with a UFO. Across the US, in the state of New York, there was another encounter case like Zamora's on the same day as the Socorro incident. The UFO encounter of New York dairy farmer Gary Thelbert Wilcox was largely overshadowed by the Socorro landing. At 10 o'clock that morning, Gary was driving a tractor when he spotted a metallic object in one of his fields next to the forest. Puzzled, he began driving his tractor toward the object. At first, he thought it must be an old refrigerator which had been in the area for a long time. As he examined the object, he realized that it was not a refrigerator, but it must be some kind of fuel tank from an airplane. Perhaps it had fallen onto the field at some point since his last visit. This thought cycle is commonly described among witnesses to the anomalous. Dr. J. Allen Hynek called this the escalation of hypotheses. Hynek explained that in many reliable UFO reports, the witness initially misidentifies the object as something prosaic until it becomes apparent that the object is not what the witness originally thought. After this, the witness continues substituting other explanations until it becomes obvious and inescapable that the object is something unknown. This quirk of the human psyche, when faced with something bizarre, gives more credence to this report. As he finally came close to the object, he realized how wrong he was. It was shaped like an egg, 20 feet in length and 14 feet in width. It was completely smooth, with no seams, bolts, or rivets. He didn't even see any doors or windows on the object. Quote, I parked the tractor at this point and walked the remaining 100 yards to the object. The first thing I noticed was that it was off the ground. It was a little bigger than a car in length. It was an oblong shape, something like an egg. There were no seams, rivets, or anything like that. It was completely smooth. It was aluminum color. I touched the thing and the metal was harder than aluminum and it did not move. I don't know whether it was on legs or hovering in the air. While I was feeling it, there was no vibration or sound and it was not hot or anything, Gary said in his sworn affidavit. After touching the UFO, 2 beings appeared to emerge from the craft. Quote, while I was touching it, 2 small men, about 4 feet high, came out from under the tank object. I don't know where they came from. Each of them was carrying a tray about a foot square. The tray looked like it was made of the same stuff the ship was made of. Inside the tray was what appeared to be sod. I was standing about a foot away from the ship. The 2 little men started walking toward me from under the ship. They stopped about 1 yard away from me. Then it sounded like one of them spoke and said, "Don't be alarmed, we have spoken to people before." Unquote. This is a common message from certain non-human beings. If we look back into our history, encounters which were referred to as angelic visitations were said to often begin with the non-human entities telling the frightened mortals, "Be not afraid." Gary said that the beings' voices were eerie and explained that their voices seemed to come from their chest. He stated, quote, their voices didn't sound like voices. It's hard to explain. I understood what they were saying, but I won't say it was English. Unquote. The interlopers continued communicating with Gary. We are from what you people refer to as planet Mars. For 2 hours, the beings remained in Gary's presence and spoke with him. He felt that their questions were oddly childlike and simple. They asked Gary everything about his tractor, manure, and agriculture. They seemed to be very interested in organic substances, as they say they are unable to grow anything on Mars. The beings told Gary that in the future, quote, Mars and Earth will be trading environments due to the rockets, missiles, and miscellaneous objects being ejected into space from Earth. Unquote. He also learned that the beings had been watching him for some time before making contact. The beings seemed against the idea of mankind entering outer space and called human space programs too primitive to survive. The beings seemed very interested in agriculture and fertilizer, so Gary offered to give the beings a bag of fertilizer. However, they could not wait for Gary to retrieve it. Wilcox asked the beings if he could go with them, but they said no. Their atmosphere is too thin for humans, they claimed. The beings also claimed that they avoided congested and dense population centers on Earth because the fumes interfered with their propulsion systems. The beings also told Wilcox that they were traveling the hemisphere and surveying life on Earth. They were only able to visit the Earth once every 2 years. The humanoids returned to their craft and disappeared inside after telling Gary not to tell anyone about their landing. Soon after, the craft rose quietly with a sound comparable to an idling car engine. After the departure of the craft, The only physical evidence of the landing was some sort of red dust apparently left behind. In his sworn affidavit, Gary stated, "They did not try to harm me in any way, and there was nothing with them that looked like a weapon. They did most of the talking." Unquote. After the Crafts' departure, Gary drove home. Within an hour, he called his mother and told her of his experience. Wilcox remembered the being's interest in fertilizer and soon after chose trying to give them a gift. Quote, "Later that same afternoon, I returned to the spot where this took place and left a 75-pound bag of fertilizer near a small tree. On returning to the scene, Saturday morning, April 25th, 1964, I found the fertilizer was gone." Unquote. This is highly reminiscent to things that you would hear from the old fairy faith, where people would commonly leave gifts behind to appease the fairy folk. Dr. Berthold E. Schwartz thoroughly investigated the Gary Wilcox case and interviewed nearly everyone involved, including Gary, as well as his friends, family, and neighbors. Dr. Schwartz stated, "I take the Gary Wilcox experience seriously, and this opinion is based on my first-hand examinations of Gary and his wife, and also direct and/or telephonic interviews of his mother, 2 brothers, Miss Baldwin, various neighbors, and Sheriff Taylor." Wilcox told his mother about his experience 1 hour after it happened and before his father read of the Zamora incident. Unquote. Dr. Schwartz's assistant, Priscilla Baldwin, interviewed Gary on April 28th and took detailed notes. Her notes were later used during the police investigation to cross-reference Gary's testimony. Priscilla claimed that she had known Gary for most of his life and vouched for his credibility. She stated, "I have known Gary since he was a boy, and knowing what a quiet, shy fellow he has always been, I have never had any doubts as to what he saw. There are people who would revel in causing this kind of excitement, but I truly believe Gary would have been the last person who would have wanted this type of notoriety." Baldwin went to Gary's home to interview him and investigate the site of the encounter. On April 29th, 1964, I went up to Gary's and asked if he would take me to the spot on his tractor. After finishing his afternoon chores, he took me up in the rain on the back of his tractor, and he also spread some fertilizer on the way. I had a camera with me and took a couple of shots. With the rainy weather, it is doubtful if they are good. I also picked up some rocks and leaves that were lying where the red dust had accumulated. However, after the rain, there was no evidence of the dust. That same day, on my return home, I contacted Sheriff Paul Taylor by telephone and told him of this incident. He had not heard of it before. He said he could not come to Newark Valley that day, but would when there was time. After not hearing if the sheriff had been up or not, I made another call to his office on Friday, May 1st, 1964. I was informed he had not, but would soon. About 1.5 hours later, an officer from the sheriff's office, George Williams, drove in my driveway. He asked if I was the one that made the complaint to his office. I said yes. I asked him if he had been up to Gary's farm, and he said he had, but found no one there. I told him I thought he would be doing chores at that time, and I offered to go back up with him, which I did. We found Gary in the barn, and after the officer questioned him for a short time, the officer wanted to go up to the place where the incident occurred. Gary did not want to interrupt his chores, but said I could show him the exact place. I agreed to go with him, and after trying the hill with the sheriff's car, decided to walk, as the ground was very muddy. We walked up, and I showed him just what Gary had shown me, and pointed out where the red dust had been, and also where he had left the fertilizer. After inspecting the surrounding areas, we came back down. The officer asked me if I thought Gary would be willing to come to the sheriff's office to make a statement, and I told him I thought he would. On returning to the barn, the officer entered the barn again and asked Gary if he would. Gary agreed to be at the office at 7 p.m. that night. The police later tested samples from the landing site and found no evidence of radiation. The police reportedly found Gary to be an honest and credible witness. In October of 1968, Dr. Schwartz would conduct a full psychiatric evaluation of Gary Wilcox. Dr. Schwartz wrote, "Wilcox had no past history for neonatal disturbances, serious illness in the formative years, neurotic character traits, dissociative or amnesic experiences, fugues, sociopathic behavior, school problems, head injury, encephalopathy, surgery, or any kind of aberrant behavior. He had never been hospitalized, and he did not have a family physician. Review of all his bodily systems revealed no disease stigmata. He was a good student in school and had 1 semester in college. He spent 3 years in the Army." Within 1 hour after the UFO experience, Wilcox telephoned his mother, and then the other members of his family quickly learned about it. Direct and telephone interviews with his mother and his 2 brothers confirmed this. No one in his family had ever experienced anything like this before. Wilcox had no previous particular interest in UFOs or any other kind of exotic subject. His reading was limited to newspapers and magazines like Look, Life, and The Reader's Digest. Wilcox and the other members of his family gave no history for any unusual paranormal phenomena before or after this episode. Wilcox had never been hypnotized. However, he was annoyed by various eccentrics and curiosity seekers who sought him out or ridiculed him. He was particularly irritated by one newspaper article that falsely stated he was being treated in a hospital in New York City for radiation burns. Though hardly affluent, Wilcox, according to his brother Floyd, turned down a considerable sum of money offered by a leading national magazine for the publication rights to his story. He also refused payments for lectures about his experience. He graciously consented to psychiatric study and freely gave permission for publication of his story in a scientific journal, with the understanding that his current address would not be revealed. Although single-witness UFO experiences have obvious drawbacks, Gary Wilcox's report is exceptional because of his unusually healthy background during and after the purported incident, the rarity of such close-range UFO occupant encounters, and the difficulty and need for recording all data that might contribute to this multifaceted problem. Should future investigations confirm the reality of such experiences for what actually seemed to happen, or for some new and strange kind of mental or psychic influence, or the converse, the discovery of some new and hitherto unrecognized type of psychopathology, the psychiatric studies would still have significance. As has been pointed out by Keel, who has had much experience with alleged contactees, the interpretation of what was supposed to have happened is an entirely open question. For example, that the occupants said they came from Mars does not mean that they came from Mars. Everything that the contactees, or UFOnauts, reputedly said should be critically analyzed from many points of view: truthfulness, purposely implanted lies, distorted propaganda, material that could be communicated and understood only by one of Gary Wilcox's psychodynamic makeup, possibility of telepathy, and so forth.
About 10 o'clock in the morning, I sped an old manure. Thought I'll headed to it up back to the barn there, and I could see this glittering thing. It was about a mile away, I guess, up on top of the hill. There's nothing in view. I mean, in the way it's all open ground, and there's no ice box up there where there's something reflected off of that. It looked just like a mirror shining in my face there, and I was going up the top of that hill to see if I was ready to plow anyway, and I drove on up with the tractor, and as I got up there about 100 feet of this glistening thing, I could see what it was. Well, I got 100, 200 yards from it there, and I couldn't see nothing. There wasn't no shining or nothing, but as I went closer, I got within 100 feet before I saw anything. This was when I took off, it was about 100 feet, and I couldn't see it. It was gone. I mean, but it looked like a wing tank to me at first. I seen them when I was in the service quite a bit, fuel tanks off these planes.
Yeah, so was it then kind of cigar-shaped as these tip tanks are?
Oh, it was more egg-shaped than anything. It was about 20 foot long, 15 or 16 foot wide, and about 4 foot deep.
How close did you get to it?
A couple inches. I was touching it for about 2 hours.
What did the surface look like it was made out of? Oh, aluminum colored, whitish colored, had a whitish cast to it, but it wasn't bright. It was shiny, but it wasn't real bright. It was just like a dish of some kind of cooking dish, really, about what it was.
Now, did a door open before these people came out of it? How did they appear? How did you meet the little men?
Well, I don't know. I was feeling everything. Then I just getting ready to come back down, call the sheriff up and see if something had fallen off the airplane, but I was kind of wondering, too, because it was off the ground. It was about 4 foot off the ground and had this idling noise. And, I don't know, nothing happened. I was touching it there for a couple of minutes, and I was just getting ready to go, and from underneath it someplace, I don't know, these two things that remember what the air came. They were about 4 foot high. I don't know what they are or who they were, but they talked to me for about 2 hours up there.
You could perfectly understand them.
Yeah, they talked better English than you're talking.
Did they talk with any kind of an accent?
No accent or nothing. I spoke German and Russian when I was in the service, and nothing like either one of them.
And what did they have to tell you? What were some of the things they said? How did they address you?
Oh, first thing they said was, don't be alarmed. You've talked to people before. And they were questioning how I had seen them and stuff. They were quite concerned. Said I shouldn't have seen them within 100 feet or so. And when I told them I saw them way down where I was putting it over, I was putting them a mile away. They were quite concerned. They said I shouldn't have seen them in the daytime like that. That's why they were in the daytime.
Did they tell you what they were doing there?
They said that they were traveling this hemisphere, this trip. Each one had a tray in their hand full of grass and stuff. It was sod. Looked like they took the knife and cut it right out of the ground, just a slab of it in each tray. That's what they were doing. They said collecting organic material and stuff.
Where did they say they were from?
Well, I mean, this sounds awful silly, I know, but they told me they were from what I know as the planet Mars. Every time they spoke of stuff, they referred to it as I know, or as we know here, like as we know Earth, as we know Mars, and stuff like that.
You sound like you find it rather hard to believe yourself.
Well, I know it. I was up there for 2 hours. I was touching the thing and talking to somebody. I don't know who it was.
And you say you talked to them for about 2 hours?
Oh, probably an hour and a half. I was up there about 2 hours altogether.
Did they mention anything about man's getting into space, sort of coming into their territory?
Well, they talk about a lot of stuff. Some of the stuff I can't say anything about. Some of it I can, but they're talking about the people were silly to go into space, that they would never survive there, just as they can't survive here. They said they can only make a trip out every 2 years, the two that were here. That they can't stand this atmosphere, that Earthmen would have even a harder time than they do, because they were telling me they're much farther advanced in this kind of stuff than we are. But they were more interested in agriculture, aspects of agriculture, than anything. They asked me what I was doing about the manure, where I got it, and what it did, and all that stuff. They didn't know nothing about agriculture. They don't have no organic material or anything like that up there. They said they survive in what they get out of the atmosphere they have.
And
they didn't stress any point. They made a lot of statements like that, but they never stressed the point. They didn't say how they lived or anything like that.
Did you say that there were other things they told you that you cannot reveal?
I mean...
Why not? Why can't you reveal these other things?
I guess I better not say anything about it.
Why?
Well, this is being investigated into yet.
Who's investigating it?
It's supposed to be the Air Force supposed to be coming around, I guess, what the sheriff says.
You can't tell us what they told you?
I shouldn't, for my own personal reasons.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us an indication of what it was? What did it concern?
Well, it concerned them being here more than anything.
Why they were here? Did these creatures have features like we do on Earth? They have eyes?
Well, they were about 4 foot tall, and they had arms and legs and heads, but whether they had features, I would presume so. Well, they just had a complete uniform, covered everything. I mean, as far as seeing features, you couldn't see anything. The voice come from the front one someplace. I don't know. Couldn't say it come from the head, or couldn't say it come from the stomach, or where. It just could hear the voice come from someplace. He was about 4 or 5 feet away from me.
What color were the uniforms?
Same color as the ship.
Sort of like a spacesuit.
Well, the same color. I didn't touch the uniform, but they looked to me like the same kind of stuff. They seemed to go back underneath the ship. The back one went first, and the front one turned around. They both went back underneath the ship, and where they went to, I don't know. It was only about 60 seconds, and the thing took off. I was standing about 6 inches from it when it took off.
And there you have, reporting from his barn in Newark, New York, Gary Wilcox, a 28-year-old dairy farmer who says he saw... Well, you heard Mr. Wilcox. This is Bob Kennedy.
Project Blue Book labeled the Socorro case unidentified. As Quintanilla explained, quote, "Despite my strong desire to find a natural explanation for the sighting, I was still unconvinced about the reality of CE3s. I could find none. The case is therefore listed in the Blue Book files as unidentified." Unquote. The Socorro case was the main factor which convinced Hynek that close encounters of the third kind are a real element of the UFO phenomenon. A close encounter of the third kind being a case where animate beings are seen in relation to the UFO, entities which we would typically refer to as aliens or non-human intelligence. In Hynek's own words, quote, "There is much more evidence to indicate that we are dealing with a most real phenomenon of undetermined origin." Prior to the Socorro case, Hynek did not believe that UFO landings actually took place. He would later call the Socorro case the Rosetta Stone of close encounter cases. Jacques Vallée, the French astrophysicist, computer scientist, and UFO investigator working with Hynek as his assistant at the time, explained that this was the case which convinced Dr. Hynek that UFO landings were a real aspect of the UFO phenomenon. Hynek would begin to openly dissent from the U.S. Air Force's conclusions on certain UFO cases. He began to champion true scientific values, insisting that the UFO phenomenon is worth the time and attention of the scientific community. Hynek even admitted that the U.S. Air Force was forcing him to give a debunk of every UFO case, and that he detested this policy, because the Socorro case, among others, had privately convinced Hynek that the UFO phenomenon was real. This put him at ever-increasing odds with the approach of Project Blue Book. Major Quintanilla, who was head of Project Blue Book at the time of the Socorro incident, wrote a classified article for Studies for Intelligence called The Investigation of UFOs. The last portion of the document, which can now be found on the CIA's website, is dedicated to the Socorro case. But first, I'd like to point out how the head of Project Blue Book opens this once classified article. Quote, "Unidentified flying objects are not a new phenomenon. In 593 BC, Ezekiel recorded a whirlwind to the north which appeared as a fiery sphere. In 1254, at St. Albans Abbey, when the moon was 8 days old, there appeared in the sky a ship elegantly shaped, well equipped, and of marvelous color. In 1520, in France, there were sighted a round-shaped object with rotating lights and 2 fiery suns. In 1874, in Texas, a farmer reported seeing a dark flying object in the shape of a disc cruising in the sky at a wonderful speed." Unquote. He continues to give a brief history of UFOs since 1947, and there is also no question about Zamora's reliability. That section of the document is titled The Policeman's Report and focuses solely on the Zamora case, where Quintanilla wrote, "There is no doubt that Lonnie Zamora saw an object which left quite an impression on him. He is a serious police officer, a pillar of his church, and a man well versed in recognizing airborne vehicles in his area. He is puzzled by what he saw, and frankly, so are we. This is the best documented case on record, and still, we have been unable, in spite of thorough investigation, to find the vehicle or other stimulus that scared Zamora to the point of panic."